The sound of glass shattering against the kitchen wall echoed through the cramped apartment as Maria Castellanos pressed her back against the refrigerator, her 3-year-old daughter Sofia clinging to her legs. The plate had missed her head by inches, leaving ceramic shards scattered across the linoleum floor like broken promises. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another girl, Victor spat, his voice thick with rage and alcohol. 3 daughters, 3 useless mouths to feed. His fist connected with the cabinet door beside Maria's head, leaving a dent in the cheap wood. My mother was right about you. You're cursed. Maria's arms instinctively wrapped around her swollen belly, now 8 months heavy with their 4th child. The doctor had confirmed it just yesterday during her appointment at the free clinic, another daughter. She hadn't told Victor yet, but somehow he knew. He always knew when disappointment was coming. Sofia whimpered against her mother's thigh, her small fingers gripping the fabric of Maria's worn dress. In the next room, 5-year-old Carmen was attempting to keep 2-year-old Isabella quiet, singing a lullaby in a whisper so soft it barely carried through the thin walls. The children had learned to become invisible when their father's anger erupted, which had become as regular as the sunrise. Victor kicked a chair across the small kitchen, sending it crashing into the stove. 4 years of marriage, and what do I have to show for it? 3 girls who'll never carry my name, never continue my legacy. My brothers have sons, strong sons who'll make something of themselves. Maria remained silent, knowing that any word would only fuel his fury. She had learned this lesson through split lips and purple bruises that she carefully concealed beneath long sleeves and makeup when she ventured to the grocery store or picked up Carmen from preschool. The neighbors in their run-down apartment complex had grown accustomed to the shouting, the crashes, the crying that seeped through the paper-thin walls of Unit 2B. The apartment itself told the story of their struggles. Peeling paint revealed water stains from the unit above. The carpet was threadbare and stained, despite Maria's constant efforts to keep it clean. Toys were few and far between, mostly dollar store finds or hand-me-downs from the church donation box. Victor's construction work provided just enough income to keep them housed and fed, but never enough for comfort, never enough for the life he had promised her when they were young and in love. You know what your problem is, Maria? Victor's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper as he moved closer. You can't give me what a real woman should give her husband: sons, legacy, respect. His hand shot out, gripping her chin roughly, forcing her to meet his bloodshot eyes. Instead, you give me burden after burden. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that Victor's own mother had given birth to 6 children, 4 of them daughters. But those daughters had married well, had found men who valued them, had built families where children were treasures regardless of gender. Maria often wondered what had twisted inside Victor to make him see his own flesh and blood as failures, simply because they were female. Please, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. The girls will hear. Let them hear, Victor snarled. Let them understand what disappointment looks like. Maybe they'll learn not to disappoint their own family someday. His grip on her chin tightened, his fingernails digging into her skin. When this baby comes, if it's another girl, I swear on my father's grave, Maria, I will not be responsible for what happens. The threat hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Maria had heard variations of this promise before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the violence in his eyes seemed deeper, more permanent. The man she had married, the man who had once brought her wildflowers and called her his princess, had been consumed entirely by bitterness and rage. Victor released her chin with a shove that sent her head back against the refrigerator. The magnetic letters that spelled out Carmen's name scattered to the floor, joining the broken plate. He grabbed his jacket from the kitchen table and headed for the door. I'm going to Eddie's bar, he announced without looking back. "When I come home, I want dinner ready and those kids are silent. And Maria?" He paused at the doorway. "Start praying to whatever God you believe in that you figure out how to give me a son, because my patience is running out." The apartment door slammed with such force that the walls shook. In the sudden quiet that followed, Maria could hear her heart pounding and Sophia's quiet sniffles. Slowly, she slid down the refrigerator until she was sitting on the floor. Gathering her youngest daughter into her lap, Carmen appeared in the doorway, carrying Isabella on her hip with the practiced ease of a child forced to grow up too quickly. At 5 years old, Carmen had already learned to change diapers, heat bottles, and comfort her younger sisters when their mother was too bruised or too broken to do it herself. "Mama, is Papa coming back tonight?" Carmen asked, her dark eyes too wise for her age. "Yes, Mia," Maria whispered, stroking Sophia's hair. "He'll be back." Carmen nodded solemnly. She understood what that meant. It meant they would eat dinner in silence, speak in whispers, and hope that Papa's mood improved with sleep. It meant Maria would apply concealer to fresh bruises in the morning and explain away any marks the neighbors might notice. The apartment building they called home sat in the poorest section of Millbrook, a mid-sized city where dreams came to die and families struggled to survive paycheck to paycheck. Built in the 1960s, the Riverside apartments had seen better decades. The hallways smelled of cigarettes and cooking grease. The elevators broke down monthly, and the parking lot was more potholes than pavement. Maria had grown up just 30 miles away in a small farming community, where her father worked the land, and her mother raised 5 children with patience and love. She had been the first in her family to graduate high school, the first to move to the city with dreams of becoming a nurse. She had met Victor at a dance hall when she was 19, and he was 22, tall and handsome in his crisp white shirt, promising her a life of adventure and security. Those promises had crumbled slowly, like old paint peeling from walls. First came the criticism her cooking wasn't like his mother's. Her friends were too loud, her dreams of nursing school were impractical. Then came the control, where she went, who she spoke to, how she spent the few dollars he gave her for groceries. The physical violence didn't start until after Carmen was born, and even then, it began as accidents, a shove that sent her into a wall, a grip that left fingerprints on her arm. By the time Isabella arrived, the pretense had vanished. Victor's disappointment in having daughters had fermented into rage, and that rage needed somewhere to go. Maria became the target, the vessel for all his frustration with a life that hadn't turned out as he'd planned. The cultural expectations that surrounded them only made things worse. Victor's family came from a traditional background where sons were prized above all else, where a man's worth was measured by his ability to produce male heirs. His mother made passive-aggressive comments during their rare visits, wondering aloud when Maria would finally give Victor what he needs. His brothers paraded their sons around like trophies, while their wives were praised for their ability to bear boys. Maria's own family lived too far away to help, and besides, what could she tell them? That the man they had welcomed into their family with open arms had become her jailer? That the grandchildren they adored were growing up in fear? Her father was too old and frail to intervene, and her mother's health had been failing for years. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her situation. Victor had systematically cut her off from friends, from opportunities to work outside the home, from any support system that might have offered her alternatives. The few neighbors who might have cared had their own problems, their own struggles. With poverty and broken dreams. As Maria sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the debris of Victor's latest explosion, she felt the baby kick inside her. Strong kicks that reminded her this child, regardless of gender, was fighting to enter the world. The doctor had asked during her last visit if everything was okay at home, had noticed the way Maria flinched when she was touched unexpectedly. But how could she explain that okay was a luxury she couldn't afford? The sound of Mrs. Chun's television drifted through the wall from the adjacent apartment. The elderly woman lived alone with her cat, and Maria sometimes heard her talking to herself in a mixture of English and what she assumed was Mandarin. Mrs. Chun had lived in the building longer than anyone else, had seen families come and go, had witnessed the cycles of poverty and desperation that defined life at Riverside Apartments. Sophia had fallen asleep in Maria's lap, her thumb in her mouth, her breathing steady despite the chaos that had surrounded her just minutes before. Children were remarkably resilient, Maria had learned, able to find peace even in the midst of storms. But she also knew that resilience had limits, that the scars being carved into her daughters' hearts would shape them for years to come. Carmen was attempting to clean up the broken plate, her small hands carefully picking up the larger pieces while avoiding the sharp edges. The gesture was heartbreaking in its maturity, a 5-year-old trying to restore order to a world that offered her none. "Carmen, don't touch that," Maria whispered, gently shifting Sophia so she could stand. "Mama will clean it up. You take care of Isabella." As she swept up the ceramic shards, Maria's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Dr. Peterson at the clinic. The elderly physician had been delivering babies in Millbrook for over 30 years, had seen every type of family situation imaginable. There had been something in his eyes when he delivered the news about the baby's gender, a concern that went beyond medical care. "Mrs. Castellanos," he had said quietly, "I want you to know that there are resources available if you ever need help, support groups, shelters, counseling services. Sometimes women in your situation feel like they have nowhere to turn." Maria had mumbled something about everything being fine, had avoided his penetrating gaze. But his business card was tucked in her purse, hidden beneath grocery store receipts and pharmacy coupons. She pulled it out now, staring at the phone. Number she had memorized but never dialed. The reality was that leaving seemed impossible. Where would she go with 3 children and a baby on the way? How would she support them without job skills or education? Victor controlled their bank account, monitored their expenses, questioned every penny spent. She had no car, no credit cards, no money of her own saved for emergencies. But staying was becoming equally impossible. Each pregnancy brought fresh waves of Victor's anger. Each daughter deepened his resentment. The violence was escalating, becoming more frequent and more severe. What had once been slaps and shoves had progressed to punches and kicks. How long before one of the children got caught in the crossfire? How long before Victor's rage turned directly toward them? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The apartment fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of other families' dramas playing out behind closed doors. Maria finished cleaning the broken plate and put away the scattered magnetic letters. She began preparing dinner with mechanical precision, browning ground beef for tacos because it was cheap and filling and wouldn't require ingredients they didn't have. As she cooked, her thoughts turned to the baby growing inside her. This child deserved better than the life awaiting her in this apartment. All her children deserved better. They deserved a home where laughter wasn't forbidden, where mistakes weren't met with violence, where their gender wasn't seen as a personal failing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Maria freeze, her hand gripping the wooden spoon. But the steps passed by their door, accompanied by the jingling of keys and the muffled voice of their upstairs neighbor returning from work. Victor wouldn't be back for hours, not until Eddie's bar closed and he'd drowned his disappointments in beer and whiskey. Those hours of peace were precious, the only time when Maria could breathe without measuring each breath, when the children could play without whispering, when the apartment felt almost like a home instead of a prison. But they were also hours filled with dread, knowing that Victor's return would bring fresh anger, new reasons for violence, another night of walking On eggshells until morning. Maria served dinner on paper plates to avoid the sound of clattering dishes. The children ate quietly, efficiently, understanding without being told that loud chewing or dropped food could lead to consequences later. They had learned to be grateful for what they had while simultaneously hoping for what they knew they would never receive. As the evening wore on and the children settled into bed, sharing mattresses on the floor because cribs and proper beds were luxuries beyond their reach, Maria sat alone in the kitchen counting the money in her small ceramic jar, $17.36. The accumulation of change from grocery shopping, coins found in couch cushions, the occasional dollar Victor forgot in his pants pockets. It wasn't enough to buy freedom, wasn't enough to rent a room for even a single night. But it was something, a tiny foundation upon which larger dreams might be built. Maria added the coins to the jar and hid it behind the cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink, in the one place Victor never looked because housework was beneath his attention. Outside, Millbrook settled into the night. Streetlights flickered on along the potholed roads, casting yellow pools of light that barely penetrated the darkness. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the city, carrying cargo and dreams to destinations unknown. Maria listened to that sound and imagined boarding that train with her children, traveling to a place where daughters were celebrated instead of mourned, where mothers were protected instead of punished. But for now, she was trapped in apartment 2B, waiting for a drunk and angry man to come home, preparing herself for another night of survival. The baby kicked again, a reminder that time was running out, that decisions would need to be made soon. In less than a month, there would be 4 children depending on her for protection she felt powerless to provide. The television in Mrs. Chun's apartment fell silent, leaving only the sound of Maria's breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Somewhere in the city, other families were tucking their children into warm beds, reading bedtime stories, planning weekend adventures. Somewhere, fathers were kissing their daughters goodnight and calling them precious. But in apartment 2B, Maria Castellano sat alone in the darkness, her hands pressed against her belly, whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten her address, begging for strength she wasn't sure she possessed, and hoping against hope that tomorrow might bring the miracle she desperately needed. Thomas Mitchell had been watching the apartment building across the courtyard for 3 weeks now, not as a voyeur but as a man who recognized the signs. The young woman on the second floor moved quick, nervous glances over her shoulder, the careful way she carried herself as if every step might trigger an explosion. He had seen it before, in his late wife's sister, in the neighbor down the street from their old house in Vermont, in the faces of women who had learned to make themselves small. At 52, Thomas had the weathered appearance of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life. His gray hair was perpetually tousled from running his fingers through it when he was thinking, and his blue eyes held the kind of patience that came from raising 4 boys on his own. His apartment in the Riverside complex was sparse but clean, furnished with the practical efficiency of a widower who had learned to make a home. Without a woman's touch, he had moved to Millbrook 6 months ago, when the construction company offered him a supervisor position that paid enough to finally get his family out of the cramped rental they'd occupied since Sarah's death 3 years earlier. The boys, Michael at 17, David at 15, Jason at 13, and little Ryan at 9, had protested the move, leaving behind friends and familiar surroundings. But Thomas knew they needed a fresh start, somewhere without the constant reminders of hospital visits and the sound of Sarah's cough echoing through the house. The Riverside apartments weren't ideal, but they were temporary. Thomas was saving every penny for a down payment on a real house with a yard where Ryan could play baseball and the older boys could have their own rooms. Unit 3A was directly across the courtyard from 2B, giving him an unobstructed view of the Castellanos families. Comings and goings. It started with small observations. The woman Maria, he'd learned from overhearing conversations in the laundry room, never left the apartment without looking both ways down the hallway first. Her children were unusually quiet for their ages, walking close to their mothers. Sighed with the careful steps of kids who had learned that loud noises brought trouble. And there was something about the way she dressed, even in the summer heat, favoring long sleeves and high necklines that spoke of secrets hidden beneath fabric. Thomas had first noticed the pattern 3 weeks ago when he was coming home from a late shift at the construction site. As he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, he heard shouting from 2B, followed by a crash that made him pause on the landing. The building's thin walls made privacy an illusion, and while most residents had learned to mind their own business, something about the violence in that male voice made Thomas's jaw clench with recognition. Sarah had once confided in him about her sister Rebecca's marriage, how Rebecca would call in tears and then make excuses when Sarah offered help. "She's trapped," Sarah had said, "and she can't see the way out because he's convinced there isn't one." Rebecca had eventually found the courage to leave, but not before years of damage that still echoed in her relationships with her children. The next morning, Thomas had positioned himself on his small balcony with a cup of coffee, ostensibly reading the newspaper, but actually watching for signs of life from 2B. Maria had emerged around 10 o'clock, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in pain. Her 3 daughters had followed like ducklings, the oldest carrying the youngest while the middle child held tight to her mother's hand. They walked to the bus stop at the corner, where Maria waited with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to public transportation. Thomas noticed how she kept scanning the street, how she positioned herself so she could see anyone approaching from either direction. When the bus arrived, she counted out exact change from a small purse, the gesture of someone for whom every penny was accounted for. Over the following days, Thomas began to piece together the rhythm of their lives. Victor, he'd learned the husband's name from the mailboxes in the lobby, left for work around 7 in the morning, his heavy footsteps thundering down the stairs with the entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him space. Maria would emerge an hour later, taking the children to what Thomas assumed was daycare or preschool for the oldest one. But it was the evenings that told the real story. Victor would return between 6 and 7, sometimes later with the stumbling gait of a man who had stopped at a bar on his way home. The shouting would start within minutes, sometimes lasting hours, punctuated by crashes and the sound of objects being thrown. Then silence, heavy and loaded with the weight of fear. Thomas's own boys had begun to notice the disturbances. Michael, wise beyond his 17 years since becoming the man of the house after Sarah's death, had mentioned it during dinner one evening. "There's something wrong next door," Michael said, pushing his mashed potatoes around his plate. "I mean, in the building across the way, that family with the little kids." David, always the most sensitive of the 4 brothers, looked up from his homework. "I heard crying yesterday." Little kids were crying like they were scared. Thomas had nodded, acknowledging their observations without revealing the extent of his own awareness. His boys had been through enough trauma for their age. They didn't need to be burdened with the knowledge that domestic violence was happening, so close to their own fragile sense of security. But the situation had escalated 3 nights ago. Thomas had been helping Ryan with his math homework when the screaming from 2B reached a pitch that made all 4 boys look up from their activities. This wasn't the usual pattern of shouting, followed by crashes. This was sustained, terrified screaming from what sounded like a woman in genuine fear for her life. "Dad," Jason had whispered, his 13-year-old voice cracking with anxiety. "Should we call someone?" Thomas had hesitated, torn between the impulse to intervene and the knowledge that getting involved in domestic disputes could be dangerous for everyone involved. But as the screaming continued, punctuated by what sounded like furniture being overturned, he made a decision that went against every instinct toward self-preservation he had developed as a single father. "You boys stay here," he had commanded, moving toward the door. "Lock this behind me and don't open it for anyone except me." "Dad, no," Michael had protested, standing up from the couch. "You don't know what that guy might do." Thomas had paused at the door, looking back at his 4 sons, his whole world, everything that mattered to him since Sarah's death. "Your mother would never forgive me if I let someone get hurt when I could have helped," he said quietly. "But I need you boys to be smart. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, you call 911. The hallway had been empty when Thomas stepped out, but the sounds from 2B were clearly audible through the thin door. He could hear a man's voice, slurred with alcohol, making threats that chilled his blood. There was pleading in a woman's voice, desperate and broken, and underneath it all, the crying of terrified children. Thomas had stood outside that door for a full minute, weighing his options. He could call the police, but he knew from his construction work how long response times could be in this neighborhood, especially for domestic disputes that officers often viewed as family matters. He could knock on the door, but that might escalate the situation and put the woman and children in greater danger. The decision was made for him when he heard a crash followed by a woman's cry of pain that was clearly different from the previous. Sounds sharper, more immediate, the sound of someone being physically hurt. Thomas knocked firmly on the door, his construction worker's hands making a sound that carried authority. The apartment had fallen silent immediately. After a moment, heavy footsteps approached the door, and Thomas could feel someone looking out through the peephole. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed but ready. "What do you want?" The voice was hostile, slurred, dangerous. "I'm from building maintenance," Thomas had lied smoothly, grateful for his years of experience dealing with difficult supervisors and hostile clients. "We've had reports of water damage from this unit, affecting the apartment below. I need to check your pipes." There had been a long pause, followed by muffled conversation he couldn't quite make out. Finally, the door had opened a crack, revealing a man in his 30s with bloodshot eyes and the flushed face of someone who had been drinking heavily. Victor Castellanos was smaller than Thomas had expected, but there was a coiled tension in his posture that spoke of unpredictable violence. "There's no water damage here," Victor had slurred, trying to block the view into the apartment. Thomas had pressed his advantage, stepping slightly forward in the way he had learned to do when dealing with contractors who were trying to hide shoddy work. "Sir, I understand this is inconvenient, but if there's a leak and we don't catch it, the damage to the building could be extensive. I just need to take a quick look at your bathroom and kitchen plumbing." Over Victor's shoulder, Thomas could see into the apartment's living room. Furniture was overturned, and there were clear signs of a struggle. But more importantly, he caught a glimpse of Maria huddled on the couch, holding what appeared to be a baby, while 2 other small children pressed close to her sides. Even from a distance, he could see that her face was swollen on one side. "This isn't a good time," Victor had started to say, but Thomas was already moving, using his larger frame and the authority that came from years of supervising construction crews to push gently but firmly past the smaller man. "I'll make it quick," Thomas had said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Just need to check the water pressure in your kitchen sink." Once inside the apartment, Thomas had moved with purposeful efficiency toward the kitchen, but his eyes were cataloging everything: the broken dishes on the floor, the overturned chair, the way Maria was holding herself as if her ribs were injured. The children were watching him with the wide, fearful eyes of kids who had learned that strange adults usually meant more trouble. Victor had followed him into the kitchen, agitated and clearly wanting him gone, but also afraid to be too aggressive with someone who might have legitimate authority. "Look, everything's fine here. You can see there's no water damage." Thomas had turned on the kitchen faucet, pretending to test the water pressure while actually scanning the room for signs of the violence he had heard. There were small drops of blood on the linoleum floor, and one of the cabinet doors was hanging at an odd angle as if it had been damaged by impact. "Pressure seems fine here," Thomas had said conversationally, as if he hadn't noticed the obvious signs of domestic violence surrounding him. "Let me just check your bathroom real quick, and I'll be out of your hair." The bathroom had told an even clearer story. There was blood in the sink, and a hand towel was stained red as if someone had been cleaning wounds. The mirror had a spider web crack in one corner, and there were dark stains on the bathroom rug that Thomas preferred not to think about. When he returned to the living room, Victor was pacing nervously while Maria remained frozen on the couch with her children. Thomas had looked directly at Maria for the first time, taking in the swollen cheek, the split lip, the way she held her left arm protectively against her side. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and in that brief connection, Thomas had seen a desperation that reminded him painfully of Sarah. During her final days in the hospital, the look of someone who was running out of options and time. "Everything looks good," Thomas had announced, knowing that Victor needed to believe the ruse had worked. "No signs of water damage that I can see. You folks have a good evening." Victor had practically pushed him toward the door, clearly relieved to have the intrusion over. But as Thomas had stepped back into the hallway, he had turned slightly and caught Maria's eye one more time. This time he had mouthed a single word: "Tomorrow." He wasn't sure she had understood, but something in her expression had shifted slightly. A tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Back in his own apartment, Thomas had found his 4 sons clustered anxiously around the door, clearly having listened to every word through the thin walls. "Dad, what's happening over there?" Ryan had asked, his 9-year-old voice small with worry. Thomas had gathered all 4 boys around the kitchen table, deciding that honesty was better than leaving them to imagine scenarios that might be worse than the truth. "There's a family in that building that's having some troubles," he had explained carefully. "The father is hurting the mother and probably scaring the children. It's not okay, and we might need to help them." Michael had leaned forward, his 17-year-old face serious with understanding. "Help them how?" "I don't know yet," Thomas had admitted. "But I know what it's like to be afraid for your family, and I know what your mother would have done if she were here." David nodded slowly. "She would have helped, even if it was dangerous." "Especially if it was dangerous," Jason had added, remembering Sarah's fierce protectiveness of anyone she considered vulnerable. That had been 3 nights ago. Since then, Thomas had been planning, researching resources, and figuring out how to approach a woman who had been systematically isolated and convinced that no help was available. He had called the domestic violence hotline during his lunch break, speaking with a counselor who had helped him understand the complexities of intervention. "You can't rescue her," the counselor had explained patiently. "She has to make the choice to leave. But you can let her know that help is available when she's ready to accept it." This morning, Thomas had implemented the first part of his plan. He had positioned himself in the laundry room in the basement of Maria's building, timing his visit to coincide with her weekly trip to wash clothes. He had brought a basket of his boys' laundry and waited, pretending to read a magazine while actually listening for footsteps on the stairs, when Maria had appeared with her basket of clothes and 3 tired children in tow. Thomas had looked up with what he hoped was a friendly but non-threatening expression. "Morning," he had said simply, not wanting to startle her. Maria had frozen for a moment, clearly recognizing him as the maintenance man who had been in her apartment. Her hand had moved instinctively to her cheek, where makeup didn't quite cover the lingering bruise from 3 nights ago. "Good morning," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas had watched as she loaded her clothes into a washing machine with the efficient movements of someone who had done this countless times. Her daughters sat quietly on the plastic chairs provided for waiting customers, the oldest one keeping watch over the younger 2 with the vigilance of a child forced into premature responsibility. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," Thomas had said when Maria finished with the washing machine. I'm Thomas Mitchell. I live in 3A in the building across the courtyard. Maria had hesitated before responding, clearly weighing the risks of engaging in conversation with a stranger. Maria Castellanos, she had finally said. These are your daughters? Thomas had asked, smiling at the children with the genuine warmth of a father who adored his own kids. Maria had nodded, her protective instincts clearly warring with her desire for normal human interaction. Carmen, Sophia, and Isabella. Beautiful. Names for beautiful girls, Thomas had said, and for the first time, Maria's expression had softened slightly. I have 4 boys myself. They're probably making a mess of our apartment right now while I'm down here. 4 boys, Maria had repeated, and there was something wistful in her voice. Thomas had sensed an opportunity. Yeah, they're my whole world. Lost their mother 3 years ago, so it's just us guys now. But honestly, I can't imagine my life without them. Each one of them is a blessing, you know. The word blessing had hit its target. Maria's eyes had filled with sudden tears that she tried to blink away. That's beautiful, she had whispered. I tell them every day, Thomas had continued, his voice gentle but carrying across the small laundry room. Doesn't matter if they're boys or girls, each child is a gift. Anyone who doesn't see that is missing out on the best part of life. Maria had stood completely still, absorbing these words like a plant that had been dying of thirst finally receiving water. In her world, children, especially daughters, were burdens, disappointments, sources of shame and anger. The concept of children as blessings was so foreign to her current reality that it was almost impossible to process. Thomas had pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, something he had prepared the night before. Listen, I know we're just neighbors, but if you ever need anything, help with groceries, someone to watch the kids for a few minutes, whatever, I'm usually home in the evenings after 6. Building 3, Apartment A. He had left the paper on the chair beside her laundry basket and gathered his own clothes, giving her space to process the interaction. As he headed toward the stairs, he had turned back one more time. Mrs. Castellanos, he had said quietly, your daughters are lucky to have a mother who loves them so much. That's obvious to anyone who takes the time to look. Then he had left, climbing the stairs back to his own building while Maria stood alone in the laundry room, holding a piece of paper with a phone number and an address, wondering if she dared to believe that help might actually exist in a world that had shown her only cruelty and indifference. The paper had contained more than just contact information. On it, Thomas had written a simple message. Every child deserves to be called a blessing. Every mother deserves to be safe. Help is available when you're ready. Below that, he had included the number for the domestic violence hotline and the address of the nearest women's shelter, information he had researched during his lunch breaks over the past few days. For Maria, standing in that basement laundry room with her 3 daughters watching her every move, the piece of paper represented something she had almost forgotten existed: possibility. For the first time in years, someone had seen her daughters not as failures or burdens, but as the precious gifts she had always known them to be in her heart. The question now was whether she would find the courage to reach for the lifeline that had been thrown to her, or if fear would win once again. Maria clutched the piece of paper from Thomas Mitchell for 3 days before she found the courage to unfold it completely. She had hidden it inside her old recipe box, tucked between her grandmother's instructions for tres leches cake and a shopping list from months ago. Each time Victor left for work, she would retrieve it, smooth out the creases, and read the words that seemed too good to be true. Every child deserves to be called a blessing. The phrase haunted her dreams and followed her through her daily routines. When Carmen asked why she couldn't play outside like other children, Maria heard Thomas's voice saying that children were gifts. When Sophia cried because her father wouldn't look at her, Maria remembered the warmth in the stranger's eyes when he had called her daughters beautiful. When Isabella reached for Victor and was pushed away, Maria felt the weight of a different possibility, a world where fathers treasured their daughters instead of resenting them. On the fourth day after their laundry room encounter, Maria made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Victor had left for work with his usual symphony of slammed doors and muttered curses, agitated because Maria's pregnancy was making her move more slowly in the mornings. She waited 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return for something forgotten. Then dressed the girls in their cleanest clothes and walked to building 3. The courtyard between the buildings was poorly maintained, with cracked concrete and weeds growing through the gaps. Children's chalk drawings from the previous summer had faded into ghostly outlines that reminded Maria of dreams that had been abandoned. As she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the stairwell. Apartment 3 had a simple brass number that gleamed despite the building's general shabbiness. Someone had taken care to polish it, a small detail that spoke of pride in circumstances that didn't inspire it. Maria raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, imagining Victor's rage if he discovered she had spoken to a stranger, had accepted help from someone outside his control. The decision was made for her when the door opened unexpectedly. Thomas Mitchell stood there in work clothes, clearly preparing to leave for his construction job. His surprise at seeing her was quickly replaced by concern as he took in her appearance. Maria realized she was trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched Isabella against her chest while Carmen and Sofia pressed close to her legs. "Mrs. Castellanos," Thomas said gently, stepping back to give her space. "Are you all right?" The simple question broke something inside Maria that had been holding back tears for months. She tried to speak, to explain why she was there, but all that emerged was a broken sob that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. Thomas immediately looked past her, scanning the hallway to ensure they weren't being observed, then gestured for her to come inside. "Boys," he called into the apartment, "come say hello to our neighbors." 4 young men appeared from different rooms, ranging in age from what appeared to be late teens down to elementary school. Maria was struck immediately by the easy affection between them, the way they moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. It was so different from her own household, where every interaction was measured against the possibility of triggering Victor's anger. "This is Mrs. Castellanos and her daughters," Thomas explained to his sons. "Carmen, Sofia, and Isabella." The oldest boy, who had his father's blue eyes and a gentle demeanor that reminded Maria painfully of her own lost dreams of family life, stepped forward with a smile. "I'm Michael. These are my brothers David, Jason, and Ryan." What happened next would stay with Maria for the rest of her life. Ryan, the youngest at 9 years old, approached Carmen with the natural friendliness of a child who had been raised with kindness. "Do you want to see my baseball card collection?" he asked. "I have one with a lady player on it. She's really good." Carmen looked up at Maria with uncertainty, clearly unused to being invited to play by boys who didn't see her gender as a disappointment. Maria nodded, and within minutes, all 3 of her daughters were sitting on the living room floor with Ryan and Jason, looking through baseball cards and listening to stories about famous players. "David's the artist in the family," Michael explained to Maria, gesturing toward the walls where several pencil drawings were hung in simple frames. "And Jason's our musician. He plays guitar." Maria studied the artwork with growing amazement. The drawings showed scenes of family life, boys playing catch, homework sessions around a kitchen table, quiet moments of reading together. But what struck her most was the joy evident in every sketch. These were the drawings of someone who saw beauty in ordinary family moments, who found subjects worthy of art in the simple act of brothers being together. "Your wife," Maria began hesitantly, then stopped, unsure how to ask about the woman who had raised such remarkable children. "Sarah passed away 3 years ago," Thomas said quietly, settling into a worn armchair that had clearly been positioned to oversee the entire living room. Cancer, but she made sure the boys knew how much they were loved before she left us. The past tense carried weight that Maria recognized. She had lost her own mother 2 years earlier, had grieved alone because Victor considered extended mourning a sign of weakness. But there was something different about the way Thomas spoke of his wife. No bitterness, no anger at being left alone with 4 children. Only love and gratitude for the time they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Maria said, meaning it. She was. Thomas smiled, watching his sons interact with Maria's daughters. "Sarah always said that children were the best teachers we could have. They show you what unconditional love looks like, how to find joy in simple things, how to be brave when you're scared." Maria absorbed these words like a parched plant finally receiving rain. In her world, children were sources of stress and disappointment, burdens to be managed rather than gifts to be cherished. The idea that they could be teachers, that their love could be unconditional, was revolutionary. "I read what you wrote," Maria said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the paper," Thomas nodded, his expression serious but kind. "And what did you think?" "I thought it sounded like something from a fairy tale," Maria admitted. "Children as blessings. It's been so long since anyone saw them that way." "What do you see when you look at them?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the children who were now engaged in an animated discussion about different baseball stadiums. Maria followed his gaze, really looking at her daughters with fresh eyes. Carmen was helping Isabella understand the pictures on the baseball cards, her 5-year-old voice patient and encouraging. Sophia was laughing at something Ryan had said, her whole face lit up with a joy that Maria rarely saw at home. Isabella was babbling happily, surrounded by boys who were treating her like a precious little sister rather than an unwanted burden. "I see everything that's good in the world," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I see hope and love and innocence. I see 3 little girls who deserve so much better than what they have." "Then you see what I see," Thomas said simply. "You see what any reasonable person would see. The problem isn't with your daughters, Mrs. Castellanos. The problem is with anyone who can't see their worth." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Maria immediately tensed, her body going rigid with fear. Victor wasn't supposed to be home for hours, but his schedule had become increasingly unpredictable as his drinking worsened. Thomas noticed her reaction and moved quickly to the window, checking the courtyard below. "It's Mrs. Patterson from downstairs," he said, relief evident in his voice. "She probably needs help with her groceries again." As Thomas dealt with his neighbor's request, Maria found herself alone with his 4 sons and her 3 daughters. She expected the boys to ignore the girls now that their father wasn't watching, to revert to the casual dismissal she had come to expect from males. Instead, Michael approached her with the same gentle respect he had shown when his father introduced them. "Mrs. Castellanos," the 17-year-old said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your daughters are really sweet. Carmen's been telling us about how she takes care of her little sisters, and it's obvious how much they love you." David, the 15-year-old artist, nodded in agreement. "We lost our mom when Ryan was only 6, and it was really hard. But Dad always made sure we knew that families stick together, that we protect each other no matter what." The boys' easy acceptance of responsibility for each other, their obvious affection for their father, and their natural kindness toward her daughters created a stark contrast to everything Maria had come to believe about how families functioned. In Victor's world, love was conditional, protection was earned, and children were either assets or liabilities. In Thomas Mitchell's household, these concepts seemed foreign. When Thomas returned, he found Maria watching his sons with an expression of wonder. "They're remarkable," she said. "How did you raise them to be so ... So what?" Thomas asked, settling back into his chair. "So kind, so confident, so ... happy." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I think it started with Sarah," he said finally. "She had this way of seeing the best in people, especially the boys. When they messed up, and believe me, they all messed up plenty, she would separate the behavior from the child. She'd say, 'You made a bad choice, but you're not a bad person.' She made them feel valued for who they were, not just for what they accomplished." "And after she died?" Maria asked. "I tried to keep doing what she would have done. I told them every day that I was proud of them, that they were the best thing that ever happened to me. When people at work would complain about their kids, I'd think about how lucky I was to have 4 sons who were growing into good men." The concept was so foreign to Maria's experience that she struggled to process it. "Even when they disappointed you?" "Especially then," Thomas said firmly. "That's when they needed to hear it most. Look, I'm not saying I'm a perfect father. There have been plenty of times when I've lost my temper or made mistakes. But I never wanted them to doubt that they were loved, that they belonged in this family." Carmen had wandered over during this conversation, drawn by the serious tone of the adult voices. She climbed onto Maria's lap with the casual affection of a child who was secure in her mother's love, despite everything else happening in her young life. "Mama," Carmen said quietly, "can we come back and visit sometime?" The innocent question hit Maria like a physical blow. Her daughter was asking for something that seemed impossible, the chance to experience kindness again, to be in a place where children were valued and protected. How could she explain that such visits might trigger violence that could destroy all of them? Thomas seemed to understand her dilemma without explanation. "Carmen," he said gently, "you and your sisters are welcome here any time your mama thinks it's safe to visit. And if there's ever a time when you need help, when things aren't safe at home, you can always come here." He looked directly at Maria as he spoke, making sure she understood that the invitation extended to her as well. "Sometimes families go through hard times," he continued. "Sometimes people need help to get through those times. There's no shame in asking for help when you need it." Maria felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time in years, she was in a space where her children were seen as valuable, where their mother was treated with respect, where the possibility of safety existed. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "I should go," Maria said suddenly, reality crashing back as she remembered Victor's schedule. "He'll be home soon, and if the apartment isn't ready ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Thomas's expression showed that he understood perfectly. He helped gather the girls who protested leaving their new friends, and walked Maria to the door. "Mrs. Castellanos," he said as she prepared to leave, "I want you to remember something. What you're living with right now, that's not normal. That's not what families are supposed to be like. Your daughters deserve better, and so do you." As Maria walked back across the courtyard with her daughters chattering excitedly about their new friends, she carried with her more than just memories of kindness. She carried proof that different ways of living existed, that fathers could treasure daughters, that children could grow up feeling valued and secure. But she also carried the terrible knowledge that returning to apartment 2B meant returning to a world where none of those things were possible, where her pregnancy with another daughter was counting down like a bomb that would explode Victor's rage into something even more dangerous than what they had already survived. The piece of paper with the domestic violence hotline number seemed to burn in her pocket as she climbed the stairs to the second floor, wondering if she would ever find the courage to make that call, and what would happen to all of them if she did. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been delivering babies at Millbrook General Hospital for 15 years, and she had developed an instinct for reading between the lines of what her patients told her. When Maria Castellanos arrived for her emergency appointment on a rainy Thursday morning, everything about her body language screamed distress that went far beyond normal pregnancy concerns. "Mrs. Castellanos," Dr. Martinez said gently, reviewing the intake form that the nurse had handed her. I see you're experiencing some cramping and spotting. How long has this been going on? Maria sat on the examination table in a hospital gown that seemed to swallow her small frame, her arms wrapped protectively around her 8-month belly. The bruising on her face had faded to yellow-green, but Dr. Martinez is trained. I caught the telltale signs of injuries that were healing in different stages, the mark of ongoing violence rather than a single incident. Since yesterday, Maria whispered, avoiding eye contact. The pain started after I fell down the stairs. Dr. Martinez had heard that particular lie countless times. Falls were the most common excuse offered by women trying to explain away injuries inflicted by their partners. The location and pattern of Maria's bruises told a different story. These were impact marks from fists and open hands, not from tumbling downstairs. Maria, Dr. Martinez said, pulling a stool close to the examination table and sitting down so they were at eye level. I need you to know that anything you tell me here is confidential. My job is to take care of you and your baby. And sometimes that means helping with more than just medical issues. Maria's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. The baby's okay, right? Please tell me the baby's okay. The ultrasound revealed what Dr. Martinez had hoped to see. A healthy baby girl with a strong heartbeat, developing normally, despite the stress her mother was experiencing. But it also revealed something else that made the doctor's heart sink. The baby was positioned in a way that suggested she might arrive earlier than expected, possibly within the next few weeks rather than the month that remained until Maria's due date. The baby looks healthy, Dr. Martinez assured her patient. But I'm concerned about the stress you're under. Chronic stress can affect both you and the baby's development. Are you getting support at home? The question triggered a response that Dr. Martinez recognized immediately. Maria's body tensed, her breathing became shallow, and she looked toward the door as if planning an escape route. These were the reactions of someone living in constant fear, someone who had been trained to view questions about her home life as potential threats. My husband works very hard, Maria said in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone who had practiced deflecting inquiries. He's excited about the baby. Dr. Martinez had learned over the years that direct confrontation rarely worked with abuse victims. Instead, she took a different approach, sharing information that might plant seeds for future consideration. Maria, I want to give you some information about resources that are available to all of our patients, she said, reaching for a pamphlet that looked innocuous enough to pass a casual inspection. There are support groups for new mothers, financial assistance programs, and counseling services. Sometimes pregnancy can bring up unexpected challenges, and it's good to know what help is available. As she handed over the pamphlet, Dr. Martinez made sure to include several business cards tucked inside. One was for the Domestic Violence Hotline, another for legal aid services, and a third for an organization that specialized in helping women with children escape dangerous situations. Doctor, Maria said suddenly, her voice cracking with emotion. What if someone doesn't want this baby because it's a girl? What if they think daughters are worthless? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with pain and fear. Dr. Martinez felt her heart break a little for this young woman, who was carrying the child that would be rejected before she even took her first breath. Maria, Dr. Martinez said firmly, any man who doesn't treasure his daughters is the one with the problem, not the children. Girls are just as valuable, just as worthy of love and protection as boys. Anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. But in some families... Maria began. In healthy families, Dr. Martinez interrupted gently, children are celebrated regardless of their gender. The problem isn't with having daughters. The problem is with men who are too small-minded to appreciate the gifts they've been given. The doctor's words echoed something Maria had heard recently, a conversation with a widower who spoke of children as blessings. The parallel wasn't lost on her, and for a moment, She allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if Victor shared that perspective. Dr. Martinez, Maria said hesitantly, if someone wanted to leave their husband, hypothetically, how would they do it? Especially if they had children and no money? The question was asked so quietly that Dr. Martinez had to lean forward to hear it clearly. But it was the question she had been hoping Maria would eventually ask, the first sign that the young woman was beginning to consider alternatives to her current situation. Hypothetically, Dr. Martinez replied carefully, there are organizations that specialize in helping women in those exact circumstances. They provide safe places to stay, legal assistance, help with finding jobs and childcare. The process isn't easy, but it's possible. She pulled out a pen and wrote a phone number on the back of her business card. This is the number for Safe Harbor Women's Center. They have counselors who can explain all the options available, and they never pressure anyone to make decisions before they're ready. Maria took the card with trembling hands, staring at the number as if it were written in a foreign language. What if he found out I called them? They're very careful about confidentiality, Dr. Martinez assured her. They understand that safety has to come first. They can even arrange for you to meet somewhere away from your home, if that would be safer. The examination concluded with Dr. Martinez scheduling a follow-up appointment for the following week. As Maria dressed behind the curtain, the doctor made a note in her chart that would alert the nursing staff to watch for signs of escalating domestic violence. She had learned that the period around childbirth was often when abusive partners became most dangerous, especially when the baby wasn't the gender they wanted. Maria left the hospital with more than just reassurance about her baby's health. She carried with her the phone number that represented possibility, tucked inside the pamphlet about prenatal resources. But she also carried the knowledge that time was running out. If the baby came early, she would have only weeks to decide whether to continue living in fear or to take the terrifying step toward freedom. The walk home from the hospital took her past Riverside Elementary School, where she could see children playing on the playground during their lunch recess. Maria paused at the fence, watching a group of girls playing jump rope while boys nearby engaged in a game of tag that seemed to include everyone regardless of gender. One little girl with pigtails had scraped her knee and was crying quietly by the swings. Without hesitation, two boys from the tag game ran over to help her, offering their own band-aids and kind words. The scene was so normal, so natural, that it took Maria a moment to realize what was remarkable about it. These children saw nothing unusual about boys caring for girls, about mixed-gender friendships, about treating each other as equals deserving of kindness. This was the world she wanted for her daughters, a world where their gender didn't determine their worth, where they would grow up expecting to be valued and protected rather than tolerated and dismissed. But creating that world would require her to make choices that terrified her more than staying in her current situation. When Maria arrived home, she found Victor's truck parked outside the building, which meant he had come home from work early. Her heart rate immediately accelerated as she climbed the stairs to their apartment, running through possible explanations for her absence. She had told him she was going grocery shopping, but she had no groceries to show for her time away. The apartment door was unlocked, which was unusual. Victor typically locked the door when he was home during the day, a habit that stemmed from his paranoia about neighbors and strangers. As Maria stepped inside, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with a beer in his hand and a stack of papers spread out in front of him. "Where have you been?" he asked without looking up from the documents. "Grocery shopping," Maria replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "But they didn't have what I needed, so I came home." Victor finally looked at her, his eyes scanning her appearance with the suspicious attention of someone looking for evidence of deception. "You were gone for 3 hours to buy groceries you didn't buy?" Maria's mind raced, trying to construct a believable explanation. "I had to wait for the bus, and then there was a long line at the store, and then I had to wait for the bus again, ... Stop, Victor commanded, his voice carrying the edge that always preceded violence. Just stop lying to me. He stood up from the table, and Maria instinctively stepped backward. The pamphlet from Dr. Martinez felt like it was burning a hole in her purse, evidence of betrayal that Victor would certainly discover if he decided to search her belongings. I called the grocery store, Victor said, moving closer to her. They said you weren't there today. So where were you, Maria? The lie fell apart like a house of cards. Maria realized with dawning horror that Victor's paranoia had evolved into active surveillance, that he was now checking up on her movements with the deliberate intent of catching her in deception. I went to the doctor, she admitted, knowing that partial truth was safer than continuing to lie. I was having some cramping, and I was worried about the baby. Victor's expression shifted from suspicion to concern, but not the kind of concern a loving husband would show for his pregnant wife. This was the concern of someone worried about losing an asset, about damage to something he considered his property. What did the doctor say? He demanded. The baby's fine, Maria replied quickly. Just normal pregnancy discomfort. Nothing to worry about. Victor studied her face, looking for signs of continued deception. After a long moment, he seemed to accept her explanation, but his next words chilled her to the bone. You don't go anywhere without telling me first, he said. Especially not to doctors. I don't want them filling your head with ideas about how I treat you. The statement revealed more than Victor probably intended. It confirmed that he was aware his treatment of Maria was questionable, that he feared outside intervention, and that he considered her access to medical care a potential threat to his control. The doctor didn't ask about anything except the baby, Maria lied smoothly, protecting both herself and Dr. Martinez from Victor's growing paranoia. Good, Victor sighed, returning to his seat at the table. Because I've been thinking about when this baby comes. If it's another girl, Maria, I think we need to consider our options. The euphemistic language sent ice through Maria's veins. What do you mean options? I mean maybe we give this one up for adoption, Victor replied casually, as if discussing what to have for dinner. Let someone else deal with raising another useless daughter. Maybe someone who actually wants girls. The suggestion hit Maria like a physical blow. The idea of giving up her unborn daughter, of handing over the baby she was already bonding with to strangers, was unthinkable. But Victor's tone suggested this wasn't really a suggestion, it was a decision he was imposing on her. Victor, we can single quotes book quotes Maria began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. We can, and we will if necessary, he said firmly. I'm not raising 4 daughters. Maria, I'm not becoming the laughingstock of my family because my wife can't produce sons. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Victor frowned, clearly not expecting visitors, and gestured for Maria to answer it. Through the peephole, she could see Mrs. Chun from next door, holding what appeared to be a plate of food. Mrs. Chun is here, Maria reported. Get rid of her, Victor commanded, but Mrs. Chun had apparently heard voices and knocked again. More persistently this time, Maria opened the door to find the elderly woman holding a plate of homemade dumplings, her weathered face creased with a smile that seemed to see more than her eyes revealed. I made too many, Mrs. Chun said in her accented English, though Maria suspected this was a charitable fiction. Good for a pregnant lady. Make the baby strong. The gesture of kindness was so unexpected that Maria felt tears threatening again. In her isolated world, small acts of generosity had become rare treasures. Thank you, Maria said gratefully, accepting the plate. That's very thoughtful. Mrs. Chun peered past Maria into the apartment, her sharp eyes taking in Victor's hostile expression and the tension that filled the small space like smoke. You take care, Mrs. Chun said quietly, her gaze meeting Maria's with an intensity that suggested deeper meaning. Baby need mama to be safe and strong. After Mrs. Chun left, Maria found herself holding the plate of dumplings and wondering if the elderly woman suspected what was happening in apartment 2B. The comment about safety hadn't felt like casual conversation. It had felt like a message from someone who understood more than she was saying. Nosy old woman, Victor muttered, but he seemed pleased with the attention Maria's pregnancy was drawing from neighbors. It fed his ego to be seen as a man whose wife was bearing his children, even if he privately resented the gender of those children. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself thinking about the phone number tucked in her purse, about Dr. Martinez's words about daughters being treasures, about Thomas Mitchell's sons who treated girls with such natural kindness. She thought about the children playing together at the school playground, about Mrs. Chun's dumplings made with care for a neighbor she barely knew. All of these small encounters were painting a picture of a world that existed parallel to her. Own a world where kindness was normal, where children were valued, where pregnant women were protected rather than threatened. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, and with it came the terrible recognition that her current life wasn't just difficult, it was fundamentally wrong. That night, as Victor slept beside her and the baby kicked restlessly in her womb, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She would call the number Dr. Martinez had given her. Not tomorrow, not next week, but as soon as she could find a safe opportunity to make the call. The baby she was carrying deserved better than a father who saw her as a failure before she was even born. Carmen, Sophia, and Isabella deserved better than a childhood spent walking on eggshells around a man who considered their existence a personal insult. And Maria herself deserved better than a life lived in constant fear, constantly shrinking herself to accommodate someone else's inadequacies and rage. The decision terrified her. But for the first time in years, the terror was mixed with something else. Hope. The phone call that would change Maria's life happened. On a Tuesday morning, while Victor was at work and the girls were eating breakfast at the small kitchen table, Maria had been carrying Dr. Martinez's business card for 5 days, rehearsing conversations in her mind, while performing the mundane tasks that filled her days. She had memorized the number for Safe Harbor Women's Center, repeating it silently, while folding laundry, while stirring soup, while pretending to sleep beside Victor's restless form. The decision to actually dial came suddenly, triggered by a moment that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. Carmen had spilled orange juice on her dress, a tiny accident that in most households would merit nothing more than a paper towel and perhaps a gentle reminder to be more careful. But Maria's immediate reaction was pure panic, her mind racing through the consequences. Victor came home early and found evidence of the spill. She found herself on her hands and knees, scrubbing at a stain that was barely visible, her heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of fear that had become the soundtrack to her existence. Carmen watched with confusion as her mother attacked the fabric with desperate intensity, and in that moment, Maria saw her own terror reflected in her 5-year-old daughter's eyes. "Mama," Carmen said quietly, "it's just juice." The simple statement hit Maria like a revelation. It was just juice. It was just a normal accident that normal children made in normal families. But nothing about their family was normal, and Carmen was already learning to fear consequences that no child should have to consider. With trembling hands, Maria helped Carmen change into a clean dress, then walked to the kitchen phone mounted on the wall next to the refrigerator. She dialed the number she had memorized, her fingers shaking as she pressed each digit. "Safe Harbor Women's Center, this is Sandra speaking. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was warm, professional, and somehow managed to convey both strength and gentleness. Maria opened her mouth to speak, then froze, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Hello?" Sandra said again. "Are you there? It's okay, take your time." I don't know if I should be calling," Maria whispered, glancing toward the kitchen where her daughters were finishing their breakfast. blissfully unaware that their mother was taking the first step toward changing their lives forever. "You called because you needed to," Sandra replied with the patient tone of someone who had guided countless women through this exact moment. "That took courage. What's your name?" Maria Castellanos." "Hi Maria, I'm Sandra Walsh, and I'm a counselor here at Safe Harbor. Everything you tell me is completely confidential, and we never pressure anyone to do anything they're not ready for. Can you tell me a little about your situation?" The words came slowly at first, then faster as Maria found herself describing the reality she had kept hidden for so long. She told Sandra about Victor's rage when she had daughters instead of sons, about the escalating violence, about his threats to give away the baby she was carrying. She described the isolation, the financial control, the way her children had learned to become invisible to avoid triggering their father's anger. Sandra listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped Maria understand that her experiences had names: emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical violence, reproductive coercion. Each term was like a key unlocking the door Maria hadn't realized was there, helping her understand that what she was experiencing wasn't just difficult marriage, but a systematic pattern of control and violence. "Maria," Sandra said when Maria had finished her account, "I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You didn't cause this, and you can't fix it by changing your behavior. This is about your husband's choices, not about anything you've done wrong." The statement was revolutionary. For years, Maria had been told that she was the problem, that better wives produce sons, that she provoked Victor's anger through her failures and inadequacies. The idea that she wasn't responsible for his violence was almost too large to comprehend. "But what if I had given him sons?" Maria asked. "What if I had been a better wife?" "Maria, there are no perfect wives, and even if there were, that wouldn't justify violence," Sandra replied firmly. "I've worked with women whose husbands were angry that they had sons instead of daughters, women whose partners found other reasons to be violent. The problem isn't what you do or don't do. The problem is that your husband has chosen to use violence to control you." They talked for nearly an hour, with Sandra explaining the services available through Safe Harbor. There was emergency shelter, housing that could accommodate Maria and her 3 daughters, with space for the new baby when she arrived. There were legal advocates who could help with protective orders and custody arrangements. There were job training programs and childcare assistance to help women achieve financial independence. But Sandra was careful to emphasize that the decision to leave had to be Maria's, made when she felt ready and when it could be done as safely as possible. The most dangerous time for women in abusive relationships is often when they try to leave, Sandra explained. "We've learned that safety planning is crucial. We never encourage anyone to leave without a plan that addresses their specific situation and risks." Maria found herself taking notes on the back of an envelope, writing down phone numbers and procedures in handwriting, so small it would be difficult for anyone else to read. The act of writing made everything feel more real, more possible, and more terrifying. "Sandra," Maria said as the call was winding down, "what about my children? What if Victor tries to take them away from me?" "That's a common fear, and it's one we take very seriously," Sandra replied. "We work with family law attorneys who specialize in these situations. The courts understand that domestic violence affects children too, and they're generally supportive of protecting children from violent environments." After the call ended, Maria sat in her kitchen for several minutes, processing what she had learned. For the first time in years, she had spoken to someone who believed her, who understood her situation, who offered concrete help rather than empty platitudes about marriage being hard work. But she also felt the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Leaving Victor would mean abandoning the only life she had known as an adult, venturing into uncertainty with 3 small children and a baby on the way. It would mean facing Victor's rage when he discovered her plans, navigating legal systems she didn't understand, and building a new life from nothing. The sound of children's laughter from across the courtyard drew her attention to the window. Through the glass, she could see Thomas Mitchell's 4 sons playing catch in the small patch of grass between the buildings. Michael was patiently teaching Ryan how to throw a curveball, while David and Jason offered encouragement and gentle corrections. The scene reminded Maria of her conversation with Thomas, of his description of children as blessings regardless of gender. She thought about Dr. Martinez's insistence that daughters were treasures, about Mrs. Chun's kindness toward a neighbor she barely knew. All of these interactions had planted seeds of possibility in Maria's mind, showing her glimpses of a world where kindness was normal and children were valued. But it was Sandra's voice that had given those possibilities concrete form, transforming vague hopes into specific plans and actionable steps. 2 days after her phone call to Safe Harbor, Maria received an unexpected visitor. She was folding laundry in the living room while the girls napped when someone knocked softly on her door. Through the peephole, she could see Thomas Mitchell standing in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. Maria opened the door cautiously, mindful of Victor's increasing paranoia about her interactions with neighbors. "Mrs. Castellanos," Thomas said with his characteristic gentleness, "I hope I'm not intruding. My boys made way too much lasagna last night, and we thought you might enjoy some." The gesture was simple but loaded with meaning. Maria understood that this wasn't really about excess lasagna. It was Thomas's way of maintaining connection while respecting the boundaries imposed by her dangerous situation. "That's very kind," Maria replied, accepting the dish with gratitude that went far beyond its practical value. "Your sons are thoughtful." Thomas glanced around the hallway to ensure they weren't being observed, then spoke quietly. "Mrs. Castellanos, I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you can call me, day or night." He handed her a small piece of paper with his phone number written in careful block letters. "I know things can be complicated in families, but sometimes people need help, and there's no shame in asking for it." Maria looked at the paper, recognizing it as another lifeline being thrown to her. "Mr. Mitchell," she said hesitantly, "how did you know? I mean, how could you tell?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My wife's sister went through something similar years ago. I learned to recognize the signs, the way someone moves when they're afraid, the way children behave when they're walking on eggshells. And I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone know they're not alone." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the stairwell. Both Maria and Thomas tensed, but it was only Mrs. Patterson from the first floor, returning from her weekly trip to the grocery store. Still, the moment reminded them both of the risks inherent in their interaction. "I should go," Thomas said, but before leaving, he added, "Mrs. Castellanos, your daughters are beautiful children. Any father who doesn't see that is blind to his own blessings." After Thomas left, Maria found herself holding 2 pieces of paper, Sandra's phone number and Thomas's. Together, they represented something she had almost given up believing in, the possibility that people would help without expecting anything in return, that kindness existed without ulterior motives, that she and her children might deserve better than the life they were currently living. That evening, Victor returned home in a mood that Maria recognized as particularly dangerous. His construction crew had been laid off for a week due to weather delays, which meant both financial stress and too much time for drinking. He slammed through the apartment door with the volatile energy of a man looking for someone to blame for his disappointments. "This place is a mess," he announced, surveying the living room that Maria had spent the afternoon cleaning. "What do you do all day while I'm out working to support this family?" Maria bit back the impulse to point out that he hadn't worked that day, that she spent her time caring for 3 children while 8 months pregnant, that the apartment was actually cleaner than it had been in weeks. Experience had taught her That logic only fueled Victor's anger. "I'll clean it better," she said instead, already moving toward the kitchen to avoid the confrontation she could feel building. "You'll clean it now," Victor commanded, following her into the kitchen. "And then you'll explain to me why the neighbor was here today." Maria's blood ran cold. Victor's surveillance of her activities had apparently expanded to include monitoring who visited their apartment. She wondered if he had been watching from somewhere, or if one of the other neighbors had reported Thomas's visit. "He brought food," Maria replied truthfully, gesturing toward the casserole dish on the counter. "His family made too much dinner." Victor picked up the dish and examined it with suspicious eyes, as if the lasagna might contain hidden messages or contraband. "Since when do we need charity from strangers?" "It's not charity," Maria said carefully. "It's just neighbors being friendly." "I don't want friendly neighbors," Victor snarled, his voice rising to the volume that always made the children disappear. "Into their bedroom. I don't want people nosing around our business, asking questions, filling your head with ideas." The accusation revealed the depth of Victor's paranoia. He understood on some level that exposure to normal family dynamics threatened his control over Maria, that seeing kindness and respect might make her question why she wasn't receiving the same treatment at home. "Mr. Mitchell wasn't asking questions," Maria protested, then immediately regretted speaking when she saw Victor's eyes narrow with dangerous focus. "Mr. Mitchell?" Victor repeated. "So now you're on a first-name basis with strange men who come to our door?" The conversation spiraled quickly into familiar territory: accusations of infidelity, demands for explanations, threats of consequences if Maria didn't convince Victor of her absolute loyalty. But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual fear and desperation, Maria found herself thinking about Sandra's words. "This is about your husband's choices, not about anything you've done wrong." For the first time, Maria saw Victor's rage for what it really was: not a reasonable response to her failures, but the tantrum of a man who couldn't control his own emotions and chose to blame everyone else for his inadequacies. The recognition didn't make the situation less dangerous, but it did make it less personal. As Victor continued his tirade, demanding that Maria promise never to speak to Thomas again, never to accept help from neighbors, never to leave the apartment. Without his explicit permission, Maria made another decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She would not promise any of those things. "Victor," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, "I think you should calm down. You're scaring the children." The suggestion that he modify his behavior, even in the gentlest terms, enraged Victor beyond anything Maria had seen before. His face flushed red, his fists clenched, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike her while she was pregnant. Instead, he grabbed the casserole dish and hurled it against the kitchen wall, sending glass and lasagna exploding across the room. The crash was followed by immediate crying from the bedroom where the children had been trying to hide. "Clean it up," Victor commanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Clean it up and think about what happens to wives who forget their place." As Maria knelt on the kitchen floor, picking up fragments of glass while her children cried in the next room, she understood that the decision had already been made. Not by her conscious mind, but by some deeper part of her that refused to accept that this was the life her daughters should grow up believing was normal. The only question now was how quickly she could make the plans that would get all of them to safety before Victor's violence escalated beyond anything they could survive. Time was running out, and Maria Castellanos was finally ready to run. The contraction started at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday, 6 weeks before Maria's due date. She lay in the darkness beside Victor's sleeping form, timing the waves of pain that gripped her swollen belly with increasing intensity. Each contraction lasted longer than the previous one, accompanied by a pressure that told her the baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. Maria had experienced early labor twice before, but this felt different, more urgent, more demanding. As she shifted carefully to avoid waking Victor, she felt a warm rush of fluid between her legs. Her water had broken, which meant there was no turning back. This baby would be born within hours, arriving into a world where her father had already decided she was unwanted. For 20 minutes, Maria endured the contractions in silence, pressing her face into the pillow to muffle any sounds that might wake Victor. She knew that once he discovered she was in labor, everything would spiral beyond her control. He would take charge of the situation, make decisions about her medical care, and be present for the birth of the daughter he had already declared a disappointment. But as the contractions intensified, Maria realized she needed help. She carefully extracted herself from the bed and padded quietly to the kitchen, where she used the wall phone to call the number she had memorized for emergencies. "Sandra," she whispered when the safe harbor counselor answered her personal line. "It's Maria Castellanos. The baby's coming." Sandra's voice immediately shifted from sleepy to alert. "How far apart are the contractions?" "About 4 minutes now," Maria replied, gripping the phone cord as another wave of pain washed over her. "My water broke. I think I need to get to the hospital, but Victor doesn't know yet." "Maria, listen to me carefully," Sandra said, her voice calm but urgent. "We've talked about this moment. You have a choice to make right now about how you want this to happen. Do you want Victor at the hospital with you?" The question cut through Maria's pain-fogged mind like a blade of clarity. She thought about Victor's threats to give the baby up for adoption, about his rage at having another daughter, about the way he would turn what should be a moment of joy into another opportunity for disappointment and anger. "No," Maria said, with sudden certainty, "I don't want him there." "Then here's what we're going to do," Sandra replied, clearly having prepared for this exact scenario. "I'm going to call an ambulance to your address. When they arrive, you tell them you need to go to Millbrook General, and you give them my name as your emergency contact. I'll meet you there." "What about my daughters?" Maria whispered, looking toward the bedroom where Carmen, Sofia, and Isabella slept in their shared bed. "Is there anyone who could watch them? Someone you trust?" Maria thought immediately of Thomas Mitchell, but involving him would mean revealing everything to someone who was essentially a stranger. Then she remembered Mrs. Chun, who had shown kindness without asking questions, who had lived in the building long enough to understand the unspoken dynamics of apartment 2B. "Mrs. Chun next door," Maria said. "She's helped before." "Good. Wake her first, explain the situation briefly, and ask if she can watch the girls until we can make other arrangements. Then wake your daughters and tell them you're going to have the baby, but keep it simple. Children are resilient, but they need to know someone will take care of them." As if summoned by their conversation, another contraction gripped Maria with such intensity that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. When it passed, she found Victor standing in the kitchen doorway, his hair disheveled and his face dark with suspicion. "Who are you talking to?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that always appeared when he suspected deception. Maria's mind raced, searching for an explanation that would satisfy him without revealing her plan. "The hospital," she said, which was technically true since Sandra worked closely with their maternity ward. "I think the baby's coming." Victor's expression immediately shifted from suspicion to concern, but it was the wrong kind of concern, the worry of someone afraid of losing control rather than someone caring for their partner's well-being. "How long have you been having contractions?" he asked, moving closer to examine her as if she were a piece of equipment that might be malfunctioning. "About an hour," Maria replied, understating the timeline to avoid his anger at not being informed. Immediately, Victor nodded curtly and moved into action with the authoritative efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. "Get dressed. I'll call my mother to watch the girls and drive you to the hospital." "Victor, wait," Maria said, panic rising in her chest. The involvement of Victor's mother would complicate everything, creating additional obstacles to any plan of escape. Mrs. Chun offered to help with the children if we ever needed it. She's right next door, and your mother lives across town. Victor paused, considering the logistics. His mother would need time to get dressed and drive to their apartment. Time during which the baby might arrive in inconvenient circumstances. Mrs. Chun's proximity made practical sense, even if it meant accepting help from someone outside his control. "Fine," he said grudgingly, "but make it quick. I want to get to the hospital before this baby decides to come." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of activity that felt both rushed and impossibly slow. Maria woke Mrs. Chun, who appeared at her door in a bathrobe and immediately understood the urgency of the situation. The elderly woman asked no questions, simply nodded when Maria explained that she was in labor and needed someone to watch the girls. "I take care," Mrs. Chun said firmly, as if the matter was already settled. "You have a healthy baby." Waking the children was harder. Carmen immediately understood what was happening and appointed herself as the responsible older sister, promising to help Mrs. Chun with Sophia and Isabella. But all three girls seemed to sense that something more significant was occurring than just another hospital visit. "Mama," Carmen whispered as Maria knelt to hug her goodbye, "are you coming back home?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. Her 5-year-old daughter had somehow intuited that this departure might be different from others, that the baby's arrival might change everything about their family circumstances. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe," Maria replied, which was the most honest answer she could give without frightening Carmen further. The ambulance arrived just as Victor was loading Maria's hospital bag into his truck. The paramedics were professional and efficient, quickly assessing Maria's condition and determining that transport was indeed necessary. As they helped her onto the stretcher, Maria caught sight of Thomas Mitchell watching from his balcony across the courtyard, his face creased with concern. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Maria saw understanding in his expression. Somehow he grasped that this was more than just a woman going into labor. This was a crossroads moment that would determine the future of an entire family. The ride to Millbrook General took 12 minutes that felt like an hour. Victor followed in his truck, occasionally pulling alongside the ambulance at red lights to peer through the windows as if monitoring Maria's condition. The paramedics kept up a steady stream of reassuring conversation, checking her blood pressure and timing her contractions with professional competence. "First baby?" one of them asked. "Fourth," Maria replied, then added, "but my first daughter will be born here." She didn't explain that all of her children were daughters, or that this distinction mattered because it represented a break from the pattern of disappointment and anger that had defined her previous births. At the hospital, everything moved with the controlled urgency of medical professionals who had managed thousands of deliveries. Maria was quickly transferred to a labor and delivery room, where nurses began the familiar routine of monitoring equipment and preparation procedures. Victor hovered nearby, asking questions about timing and procedures with the entitled demeanor of someone who expected to control every aspect of the experience. "Mr. Castellanos," one of the nurses said, "we'll need you to step out while we get your wife settled and examined." It was a routine request, but Victor's reaction was anything but routine. His face flushed with anger at being excluded from any part of the process, and Maria could see the familiar signs of an impending explosion. "This is my wife and my baby," Victor snarled. "I have every right to be here." The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had clearly dealt with difficult family members before, remained calm but firm. "Sir, this is standard procedure. You'll be able to come back once we've completed the initial assessment." As Victor was reluctantly escorted to the waiting area, Maria felt a rush of relief that had nothing to do with the break between contractions. For the first time in hours, she could breathe without calculating how her words or actions might trigger his anger. "Mrs. Castellanos," Patricia said once they were alone, "Dr. Martinez asked me to let you know she's on her way. She wanted to be here for your delivery." The news that Dr. Martinez would be present filled Maria with gratitude and hope. Having an ally in the delivery room, someone who understood her situation and would advocate for her choices, felt like a gift she hadn't dared to expect. 20 minutes later, Dr. Martinez arrived with Sandra Walsh in tow. Sandra's presence in the hospital was explained as part of Safe Harbor's patient advocacy program, which provided support for women in crisis during medical procedures. Victor would have no reason to question her involvement, especially given his general discomfort with emotional support services he considered unnecessary. "Maria," Dr. Martinez said, taking her hand with the gentle authority of someone who had guided countless women through childbirth, "how are you feeling?" "Scared," Maria admitted, then clarified, "not about the birth, about what comes after." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "We're going to take this one step at a time. Right now your job is to focus on bringing this baby safely into the world. Sandra and I will handle everything else." The labor progressed quickly, as if the baby was eager to escape the tension that had surrounded her development. Between contractions, Sandra quietly explained the options available to Maria once the baby was born. Safe Harbor had arranged for emergency housing that could accommodate a mother with 4 children. Legal advocates were standing by to file for protective orders. Social services had been contacted about the potential need for immediate intervention. "But Maria," Sandra emphasized, "none of this happens unless you choose it. Even now, even in labor, you can change your mind and go home with Victor. We're here to support whatever decision you make." The choice became clear during the final stages of labor, when Victor was readmitted to the delivery room and immediately began expressing his disappointment that the baby was taking so long to arrive. His impatience with the natural process of childbirth, his irritation at being excluded from control over the medical procedures, and his obvious anxiety about the baby's gender created a toxic atmosphere that made the nurses exchange concerned glances. "This is taking too long," Victor complained to Dr. Martinez. "Can't you speed this up somehow?" "Labor takes as long as it takes, Mr. Castellanos," Dr. Martinez replied coolly. "We don't rush these things for convenience." "Convenience?" Victor's voice rose dangerously. "I've got work tomorrow, and my wife has been dragging this out for hours." The comment revealed everything wrong with Victor's perspective on what should have been one of the most significant moments in their family's life. He saw Maria's labor not as the miraculous process of bringing his child into the world, but as an inconvenience that was disrupting his schedule. Maria looked at Sandra, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room, and made a decision that had been building for weeks. She mouthed a single word, "Yes." Sandra nodded once, understanding immediately, and slipped out of the room to make the phone calls that would set Maria's escape plan into motion. The baby arrived 40 minutes later, after a final push that felt like breaking free from chains that had bound Maria for years. Dr. Martinez caught the tiny, perfect girl and immediately placed her on Maria's chest, where she opened dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with curious intelligence. "She's beautiful," Dr. Martinez announced, and Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at her 4th daughter healthy, alert, and completely precious. Victor approached the bed with reluctant steps, his expression confirming Maria's worst fears. He looked at his newest daughter with disappointment, so obvious that even the medical staff noticed his lack of enthusiasm. "Another girl," he muttered, as if the baby's gender was a personal insult rather than a biological reality. "Another blessing," Maria said firmly, looking directly at Victor with strength she didn't know she possessed. "Another perfect, beautiful blessing." The contradiction hung in the air between them, representing the fundamental divide that had made their marriage impossible to sustain. Victor saw daughters as failures. Maria saw them as gifts. Victor demanded control. Maria was choosing freedom. Victor offered anger and disappointment. Maria was choosing love and protection. As the medical staff completed the procedures following delivery, Sandra returned to the room with information that changed everything. "Maria," she said quietly, "I've spoken with hospital security and social services. Everything is arranged whenever you're ready." Victor, focused on his own discomfort and unaware of the undercurrents in the room, missed the significance of Sandra's words. But Maria understood perfectly. The door to freedom was open, and all she had to do was walk through it, holding her newborn daughter against her chest. Surrounded by people who supported her choice and protected her right to make it, Maria Castellanos finally found the courage to speak the words that would change everything. "Victor," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say, "I want you to leave. I don't want you here anymore." The confrontation that followed would be the last one Maria would ever have to endure alone. The silence that followed Maria's words stretched through the hospital room like a held breath. Victor stood frozen beside the bed, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear as he processed what his wife had just said. The medical staff continued their post-delivery procedures with professional focus, but Maria could sense their heightened awareness of the tension crackling through the air. "What did you say?" Victor's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that had always preceded his worst explosions. Maria looked down at her newborn daughter, drawing strength from the tiny life cradled against her chest. The baby's eyes were open, alert and peaceful, as if she understood that she had been born into a moment of transformation. "I said I want you to leave, Victor. I don't want you here anymore." "You don't get to make that decision," Victor snarled, stepping closer to the bed with clenched fists. "This is my child, my wife, my family. You don't dismiss me like I'm some stranger." Dr. Martinez moved smoothly between Victor and the bed, her body language shifting from medical professional to protective guardian. "Mr. Castellanos, I need you to step back. Your wife has just given birth and needs rest and quiet." "Don't tell me what my wife needs," Victor snapped, his face flushing with the familiar red of barely controlled rage. "I know what she needs better than anyone in this room." Sandra Walsh emerged from the corner where she had been quietly observing, her presence suddenly commanding despite her soft-spoken demeanor. "Mr. Castellanos, I'm Sandra Walsh from Safe Harbor Women's Center. I'm here as Mrs. Castellanos' patient. Advocate." The introduction hit Victor like a physical blow. His eyes widened as he processed the implications of a domestic violence organization being present at his child's birth. "Patient advocate?" he repeated, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "What the hell is going on here?" "Maria has requested our services," Sandra replied calmly, "and she has every legal right to determine who she wants present during her medical care and recovery." Victor's gaze whipped back to Maria, his expression shifting from confusion to betrayal to murderous rage. "You called them? You brought strangers into our private business." Maria met his eyes steadily, no longer shrinking from his anger. "I called them because I needed help. Because our daughters deserve better than growing up afraid. Because this baby deserves better than a father who sees her as a disappointment before she's even an hour old." "How dare you?" Victor whispered, his whole body trembling with fury. "How dare you betray your own family, your own husband? I work every day to support you and those kids, and this is how you repay me. Supporting us isn't the same as terrorizing." "U.S.," Maria replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Working every day doesn't give you the right to hit me, to threaten our children, to make us live in fear of your moods." The confrontation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Two hospital security guards entered, followed by a woman in a business suit, who introduced herself as Janet Coleman from Child Protective Services. Victor's face went white as he realized the scope of what was happening. "Mrs. Castellanos, Janet," said with professional kindness, I understand you've requested our assistance in ensuring the safety of your children. We've been working with Safe Harbor to coordinate services for you and your family." Victor looked around the room at the assembled Allies medical staff, domestic violence advocates, child protection workers, security personnel, and for the first time in years found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His usual tactics of intimidation and control were useless against professionals trained to handle exactly his type of behavior. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Maria, you can't do this. Think about what you're throwing away. Think about our family, our home, everything we've built together." "I am thinking about our family," Maria replied, adjusting the baby in her arms as if shielding her from Victor's presence. "I'm thinking about Carmen having nightmares because she's afraid you'll hurt me. I'm thinking about Sophia learning to be invisible so she won't make you angry. I'm thinking about Isabella growing up believing that daughters are worthless. I'm thinking about this baby deserving to be welcomed into the world with joy instead of disappointment." Her words landed like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of Victor's justifications and excuses. He opened his mouth to argue, to rage, to demand, but Dr. Martinez stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "Mr. Castellanos," she said firmly, "your wife has made her decision about her medical care and her family's safety. You can either respect that decision and leave voluntarily, or security will escort you out. Those are your only options." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Victor looked from face to face, searching for an ally, someone who might support his position or at least show sympathy for his situation. He found nothing but professional resolve and protective determination. "Fine," he said finally, his voice bitter with defeat and growing rage. "Fine, but this isn't over, Maria. You think these people can protect you forever? You think you can just throw away 8 years of marriage because you're having some kind of breakdown?" "This isn't a breakdown, Victor," Maria replied with quiet certainty. "This is me finally waking up." Victor stormed out of the room, his exit accompanied by threats and curses that echoed down the hospital corridor until security escorted him completely off the premises. The departure left behind a profound silence that felt different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of relief, of breathing freely for the first time in years. Sandra Walsh approached the bed where Maria was holding her daughter, tears streaming down her face as the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. "How do you feel?" Sandra asked gently. "Terrified," Maria admitted with a shaky laugh. "But also free. Like I can finally breathe all the way down to my lungs." Over the next several hours, as Maria rested and bonded with her newborn daughter, the machinery of her escape plan swung into full motion. Sandra coordinated with Safe Harbor's emergency housing program, securing a furnished apartment that could accommodate Maria and her 4 children. Legal advocates prepared protective orders and custody paperwork. Social services arranged for expedited processing of benefits applications and child care assistance. But perhaps most importantly, a network of support began to form around Maria that would help sustain her through the difficult transition ahead. Dr. Martinez volunteered to continue as her primary physician without charge until she could establish new insurance. The hospital's social work department connected her with job training programs and educational opportunities. Even Mrs. Chun, who had been caring for the 3 older girls, sent word through Sandra that she would be happy to help with childcare whenever Maria needed it. The most surprising source of support came from Thomas Mitchell, who appeared at the hospital the next morning with all 4 of his sons in tow. They carried balloons, flowers, and a card that Ryan had made for the new baby, decorated with drawings of baseball players and the carefully printed words, "Welcome to the world." "Mrs. Castellanos," Thomas said with his characteristic gentleness, "we heard about the baby and wanted to congratulate you. The boys insisted on coming to meet their new neighbor. Maria looked at Thomas's 4 sons, Michael, David, Jason, and Ryan, standing around her hospital bed with genuine joy on their faces as they admired her daughter. Their excitement about the baby's arrival was so different from Victor's reaction that it took her breath away. "She's beautiful," Michael said with the sincerity of a young man who had been raised to value children regardless of gender. "What's her name?" Maria looked down at her daughter, realizing that in all the chaos of the previous day, she hadn't even had time to consider names. Victor had refused to discuss names for girls, insisting that she would eventually give him a son who would deserve the honor of being named after his grandfather. "Hope," Maria said suddenly, the name emerging from some deep place in her heart. "Her name is Hope." David, the artist of the family, smiled with appreciation. "That's perfect. She looks like Hope." Thomas stepped closer to the bed, his expression serious despite the joy of the occasion. "Mrs. Castellanos, I want you to know that my boys and I are here if you need anything. Moving with children isn't easy, and everyone needs neighbors who care." The offer was made without conditions or expectations, simply one parent offering support to another in recognition of shared struggles and common humanity. Maria felt tears welling up again, overwhelmed by the kindness she was receiving from people who owed her nothing but chose to help anyway. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. If you hadn't shown me that fathers could treasure their daughters, you would have figured it out on your own," Thomas interrupted gently. "You just needed to see what was possible. Courage was always there, Mrs. Castellanos. You just needed permission to use it." The boys spent an hour visiting with Maria and baby Hope, sharing stories about their own family and asking questions about what it was like to have sisters. Their natural acceptance of the idea that girls were just as valuable as boys provided a stark contrast to everything Maria's daughters had experienced with their father. "When Hope gets bigger," Ryan announced with 9-year-old certainty, "she can play baseball with us. Girls can be really good at baseball." "When Hope gets bigger," Jason added, "she have 3 big sisters to teach her everything she needs to know." "That's pretty lucky." The simple statements, delivered with the unconscious wisdom of children who had been raised with love and respect, painted a picture of the future that awaited Maria's daughters. They would grow up in a world where their gender didn't limit their possibilities, where they were valued for who they were rather than judged for what they weren't. 3 days later, Maria was discharged from the hospital with baby Hope and transported directly to the Safe Harbor Emergency Housing Facility. The apartment was small but clean, furnished with donated items that had been carefully selected to create a sense of home rather than institutional temporary housing. Carmen, Sophia, and Isabella were waiting with Mrs. Chun, who had volunteered to help with the transition. The reunion between Maria and her 3 older daughters was emotional and overwhelming. Carmen immediately appointed herself as Hope's big sister and protector, while Sophia and Isabella marveled at how small and perfect their new sibling was. For the first time in their young lives, they were experiencing the arrival of a new baby as a celebration rather than a source of tension and disappointment. "Mama," Carmen said as they settled into their new living room, "is Papa coming here too?" The question Maria had been dreading came with the innocent directness that only children possessed. She gathered all 3 girls around her on the couch, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, and tried to find words that would be honest without being frightening. "Papa and Mama are going to live in different places now," she explained carefully. "Sometimes when grown-ups can't agree on how to take care of their family, they decide it's better to live apart. But that doesn't change how much Mama loves you, and it doesn't change the fact that you are all precious and perfect, exactly as you are. Will Papa visit us?" Sophia asked, her 3-year-old mind struggling to understand the concept of family separation. "I don't know yet, Mia," Maria replied honestly. "There are some things that grown-ups have to figure out with the help of other grown-ups." But I promise you that Mama will always keep you safe, and you will always be loved." Carmen, wise beyond her 5 years, seemed to understand more than she could articulate. "Mama," she said quietly, "I think Hope is lucky she gets to grow up with you deciding everything instead of Papa being angry all the time." The insight from her eldest daughter confirmed what Maria had known in her heart. The children had been aware of the dysfunction in their household, had absorbed the tension and fear that Victor's presence created. Their relief at being in a peaceful environment was palpable, expressed through louder laughter, more relaxed play, and the gradual emergence of personalities that had been suppressed by the need to avoid triggering their father's anger. Over the following weeks, as Maria navigated the complex process of building a new life, she discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She enrolled in a job training program for medical office administration, a field that would allow her to support her family while maintaining reasonable hours for child rearing. She worked with legal advocates to finalize protective orders and custody arrangements that prioritized the children's safety and well-being. Most importantly, she began the process of healing, both from the trauma of her marriage and from the deeper wounds of believing she was somehow responsible for Victor's violence. Through counseling sessions with Sandra and support group meetings with other survivors, Maria learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation and control that had kept her trapped, and to develop the tools she would need to prevent future relationships from becoming similarly destructive. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency. Victor's behavior during the hospital confrontation had been witnessed by multiple professionals, all of whom were prepared to testify about his threatening demeanor and obvious lack of concern for his newborn daughter's well-being. His history of domestic violence, documented through medical records and police reports that Maria had been too afraid to file previously, painted a clear picture of a man who posed a danger to his family. When the final custody hearing concluded 6 months later, Maria walked out of the courthouse with sole physical custody of all 4 daughters and a protective order that prohibited Victor from contacting them directly. He would be allowed supervised visitation once per month, contingent on his completion of anger management and parenting classes that he had shown no interest in attending. The victory felt surreal after years of believing that escape was impossible. Maria stood on the courthouse steps with Hope in her arms and her 3 older daughters holding hands beside her, looking out at a future that was uncertain but filled with possibility. "Mama," Carmen said, tugging on Maria's sleeve, "where are we going now?" The question had multiple layers of meaning. Practically, they were going back to their apartment, where Maria would continue the work of building their new life. But metaphorically, they were going towards something none of them had experienced before, a family dynamic based on love, respect, and the fundamental belief that all children were treasures, regardless of their gender. "We're going home, Mia," Maria replied, adjusting Hope in her arms and reaching for Sophia's hand. "We're going to our real home, where little girls are called blessings every single day." As they walked toward the bus stop that would take them back to their apartment, Maria thought about Thomas Mitchell's words on that first day in the laundry room. "Every child deserves to be called a blessing." She had carried those words through months of fear and uncertainty, through the terrifying process of leaving everything familiar, through the overwhelming work of rebuilding their lives from nothing. Now watching Carmen help Isabella navigate the courthouse steps while Sophia chattered excitedly about the ice cream they would have to celebrate, Maria understood that Thomas had been right about more than just children being blessings. He had been right that people would help, that kindness existed, that courage could be found even in the darkest circumstances. The bus arrived with the familiar wheeze of hydraulic brakes, and Maria helped her daughters climb aboard. As they found seats near the back, Hope stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with curious intelligence. Maria looked down at her youngest daughter and whispered the words she had longed to say during those terrifying final weeks of pregnancy. Welcome to your real life, little one. Welcome to a world where you are treasured exactly as you are. The bus pulled away from the courthouse, carrying Maria Castellanos and her 4 daughters toward a future that would be filled with challenges and uncertainties, but also with something they had never experienced as a complete family: the freedom to love and be loved without fear, the space to grow and dream without limitation, and the fundamental security of knowing that they were valued for exactly who they were. Behind them, the courthouse grew smaller in the distance, a symbol of the legal validation of what Maria had known in her heart from the moment she first held Carmen in her arms 8 years earlier. Every child deserved to be called a blessing, and every mother deserved the chance to raise her children in peace and safety. As the bus wound through the streets of Millbrook toward their apartment, Maria silently thanked all the people who had helped make this moment possible: Dr. Martinez, who had seen the signs and offered resources; Sandra Walsh, who had guided her through the process with patience and wisdom; Thomas Mitchell, who had shown her what healthy family dynamics looked like; Mrs. Chun, who had offered kindness without questions; and countless others who had chosen to help simply because it was the right thing to do. But mostly, she thanked her daughters, all 4 of them, for giving her a reason to find courage she didn't know she possessed, for teaching her that love could be stronger than fear, and for showing her every day that children truly were the greatest blessings life had to offer. The bus carried them home to their new beginning, where 4 little girls would grow up knowing they were treasured, valued, and loved exactly as they were. Daughters who were called blessings every single day. 2 years later, Maria stood in the kitchen of their own house, a small 2-bedroom home with a fenced yard that she had purchased with money saved from her job as a medical office coordinator. The mortgage payments were manageable, the neighborhood was safe, and for the first time in her adult life, Maria's name was on a deed as the sole owner of property. Carmen, now 7, was helping 6-year-old Sofia with her homework at the kitchen table while 4-year-old Isabella played with blocks nearby. 2-year-old Hope toddled around the living room, chattering in the mixture of Spanish and English that had become the soundtrack of their household. The chaos was normal, healthy, joyful, the kind of controlled mayhem that characterized families, where children felt secure enough to simply be children. The transformation in all 4 girls had been remarkable to witness. Carmen had blossomed into a confident first grader who volunteered to read aloud in class and made friends easily. Sofia, once the quietest of the 3 older girls, had discovered a talent for drawing that reminded Maria of David Mitchell's artistic abilities. Isabella, who had barely spoken during the final months with Victor, now chattered constantly, asking questions about everything she encountered with the boundless curiosity of a secure 4-year-old. But it was Hope who embodied the fullest expression of what Maria's family could be when fear was absent. At 2 years old, she was fearless in the way that children should be: climbing furniture, exploring every corner of their house, approaching strangers with the confident expectation that adults would be kind to her. She had never known a world where her gender made her unwelcome, had never learned to make herself small to avoid triggering someone's anger. The house itself had become a sanctuary that reflected their new reality. The walls were covered with the girls' artwork, photographs from school events and birthday parties, certificates recognizing Carmen's reading achievements and Sofia's participation in the school art fair. There were no holes in the walls from fists, no broken dishes hastily glued back together, no carefully concealed evidence of violence. The kitchen window looked out onto their small backyard, where Maria had planted a vegetable garden with the girls' help. Tomatoes and peppers grew alongside marigolds and sunflowers, creating a riot of color that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The garden had become a metaphor for their new life, requiring patience and nurturing, but ultimately producing beauty and sustenance that belonged entirely to them. On weekends, Thomas Mitchell and his sons would sometimes visit, maintaining the friendship that had begun during those dark days at Riverside Apartments. Michael was now 19 and attending community college while working part-time, but he still made time to throw a baseball with Carmen, who had indeed proven to have an excellent arm. David, now 17, had started giving informal art lessons to Sophia, recognizing in her the same passion for drawing that drove his own creative expression. Jason, 15 and now taller than his father, had appointed himself as Hope's honorary big brother, carrying her around their yard on his shoulders while she shrieked with delight. Ryan, 11 now and the undisputed expert on all things baseball-related, had taught all 4 girls the rules of the game and insisted that they would make excellent players when they got older. Thomas himself had become something Maria had never expected to have: a friend who asked nothing in return, who celebrated their successes and offered practical help during challenges. When Hope had been hospitalized with pneumonia the previous winter, Thomas had volunteered to pick up the older girls from school every day until she recovered. When Maria's car had broken down and repairs seemed financially impossible, Thomas had quietly arranged for a mechanic friend to fix it at cost. "You know," Thomas had said during one of their conversations, "Sarah always told the boys that families aren't just about blood relations. She said families are made up of people who choose to love and protect each other, regardless of their legal connections." The wisdom in those words had helped Maria understand that the network of support surrounding her daughters wasn't just temporary assistance, it was the foundation of a chosen family that would continue to grow and strengthen over time. Dr. Martinez had remained their family physician, tracking the girls' development with the special attention of someone who had witnessed their escape from danger. During Hope's 2-year checkup, she had marveled at the toddler's confident personality and advanced verbal skills. Children who grow up feeling secure develop differently, Dr. Martinez had explained to Maria. Hope has never known fear as a constant companion, and it shows in every aspect of her development. She expects the world to be safe and welcoming, so she approaches life with curiosity instead of caution. The contrast with her older daughter's early development was striking. Carmen, Sophia, and Isabella had all exhibited signs of chronic stress. During their early years, delayed speech, excessive caution around adults, difficulty sleeping through the night. Those symptoms had gradually disappeared as their sense of security grew. But Hope had never needed to overcome them because she had never experienced the trauma that created them. Sandra Walsh from Safe Harbor had become more than a counselor. She had become a mentor and friend who helped Maria navigate the ongoing challenges of single parenthood. Through Sandra's guidance, Maria had learned to recognize the difference between normal parenting stress and the hypervigilance that resulted from years of abuse. "You're allowed to have bad days," Sandra had reminded her during one particularly difficult period when Hope was teething and Carmen was struggling with a challenging teacher. "You're allowed to lose your patience, to feel overwhelmed, to wonder if you're doing everything wrong. Those feelings don't make you a bad mother, they make you human." The legal aftermath of Maria's escape had continued to unfold over 2 years. Victor had eventually completed the required parenting classes and anger management counseling, but his supervised visits with the girls had been sporadic and ultimately discontinued when he failed to show up for scheduled appointments 3 consecutive times. His financial support was minimal and irregular, despite court orders requiring consistent child support payments, but Maria had discovered that she didn't need Victor's money to provide for her daughters. Her job at the medical office had led to promotions and increased responsibilities. She had completed her medical office administration certification and was considering pursuing additional training in medical coding, which would qualify her for higher-paying positions. More importantly, she had built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or financial support. The house was modest, but it was theirs. The furniture was a mixture of new purchases and donated items, but every piece had been chosen with love and consideration for her daughter's needs. The groceries in their refrigerator were purchased with money she had earned, allocated according to priorities she had set. Financial independence had brought emotional independence as well. Maria no longer jumped at unexpected sounds, no longer calculated every word before speaking, no longer moved through her days with the constant awareness of someone else's potential anger. The hypervigilance that had kept her family safe during the dangerous years was gradually being replaced by the normal awareness that characterized healthy families. The healing process had extended beyond Maria herself to encompass all 4 girls. Carmen had stopped having nightmares about Papa coming back angry. Sophia had started singing again, her clear voice filling their house with melodies that ranged from pop songs she learned at school to lullabies she made up for Hope. Isabella had embraced her role as a big sister with enthusiasm, helping Hope learn to walk, to talk, to navigate their world with confidence. But perhaps the most profound change was in their relationships with each other. Without the need to protect themselves from Victor's anger, the girls had discovered the joy of sisterhood. Carmen taught Sophia how to ride a bicycle. Sophia shared her art supplies with Isabella. Isabella included Hope in her pretend games, adapting the rules to accommodate a toddler's capabilities. Their home had become filled with the sounds of healthy childhood laughter that wasn't hushed, arguments that didn't end in terror, music and games and conversations that flowed naturally without the careful monitoring that had characterized their previous existence. On this particular evening, as Maria finished cleaning up after dinner and prepared to help with bedtime routines, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once believed she was trapped in an impossible situation had become someone who owned her own home, supported her family through meaningful work, and raised daughters who expected to be valued and respected. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been moments of doubt, periods of financial stress, nights when Maria questioned whether she had made the right choice in leaving Victor. But those moments had become increasingly rare, as the evidence mounted that their new life was not just different from their old one. It was immeasurably better. As she tucked Hope into her crib and listened to Carmen read a bedtime story to Sophia and Isabella, Maria understood that the greatest gift she had given her daughters wasn't safety or security, it was the knowledge that they deserved both. They would grow up expecting to be treated with kindness, demanding respect from future partners, understanding that their worth wasn't determined by their gender or their ability to please others. They would become women who called their own daughters blessings, who built families based on love rather than control, who refused to accept violence as an inevitable part of relationships. The cycle of abuse that had shaped Maria's marriage would end with her generation, broken by the simple but revolutionary act of choosing courage over fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and learning. But tonight, in their own house with their own dreams taking shape around them, Maria Castellanos and her 4 daughters rested in the security of knowing they were exactly where they belonged together, safe and treasured for who they were, rather than diminished for who they weren't. The little girls who had once been seen as disappointments were growing up knowing they were blessings, and that knowledge would shape everything they became. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.